Okay, let's talk about form and leadbelly. Form is one thing I do get pretty excited about. I wasn't always that way. I think Tyehimba Jess may have been like the writer who turned that for me, to be honest. Because before I was like, form is just a tool of the patriarchy. It's just the man trying to keep my poetry down. And after reading Leadbelly years before Olio came out, I was like, oh man, form is kind of dope. Form is really powerful too. So here are some things that I see with form in the text, and I'm really excited to hear your ideas as well. What else you see going on? So of course there's the regular kind of poem, and by regular I mean a poem with medium length lines, which would be 10 to 15 syllables per line, and medium length poem. So that would be like from half a page to a page and a half. That would be about medium length to me. So we have those poems that run throughout. Generally, Leadbelly does not speak through those poems. They are designated to other people, to Black women, to inanimate objects, to white men. The form that is given to Black men in this book is the prose poem. This is before Leadbelly meets Lomax, that he communicates through the prose poem. It changes for him after that. So there are a couple of moments that kind of deviate, but I think it'll still fit, which is on page 53, Mooring Sport. This is still coming from Leadbelly's perspective, but it also has the white chorus perspective as well. It is a prose poem, and it is the first multivocal poem in this book. So for that reason, it's important. It's the first multivocal and first prose poem that includes a non-Black male's voice. And then a couple of pages later, on page 55, Leadbelly sings to his crew. We get a multivocal poem there where the lyrics to one of the Leadbelly work songs runs down the left of the page, and his perspective is in prose poem off to the center and right of the page. So that's still a prose poem, but it's also multivocal. I did want to point that out. One other place where we see Leadbelly deviate early in the book is, which means before he meets Lomax, is in his letter, his epistolary poem. So this is another form that Tyehimba Jess uses, the epistolary poem. It's the poem called Governor Pat Neff on page 35. The poem where he starts, "Dear Your Honor, you may remember me when you visits prison here. I am Walter Boyd Leadbelly, number this, that, your best," and then goes on. So, and he's pleading to be let out, and is like, "You remember, you promised me, blah, blah, blah." So what's interesting to me about this poem on page 35 is that it's a moment when Leadbelly deviates from the form he normally speaks in. Both the physical form of the poem, it going from like a regular poem with regular line breaks it going from a prose poem to a poem with regular poem and regular line breaks, and the diction changes. Leadbelly no longer has the thick, flowery prose that he normally has, very poetic language that he normally communicates in. Instead, he is using this very stereotypically countrified Negro kind of diction. And it's notable that he's using both the form and the diction to communicate to this white man in power. So that is our first epistolary poem in the book, and we do get several others, but it's also our first poem with more that uses capitalization at all. This is the first poem that uses capitalization at all. In the "Dear Your Honor" and then the "You may remember," he starts off the sentence with the "you." He capitalizes the first person I, and this is also, I think, the only poem that uses no punctuation. If it's not the only poem, then it's one of the few. There are no periods, and periods have been the thing that is, have been key in the rest of the book to communicate where phrases stop, since we don't have capitalization. But here we have capitalization, but we don't have punctuation. And here he also uses spacing to communicate the end of a thought. So he'll add a tab after down in the valley, tab. What a friend we have in Jesus, and I Sugarland shuffle like picking cotton far as the eye can see. So this is, I think, one of those pivotal poems in the book that just tells us, as he's teaching us how to read his book, this is one of the poems that teaches us what we're supposed to understand about form and in the way that the language, the punctuation, the capitalization happens. So there are other epistolary poems. There's one erasure poem here on page 72. Erasure poems are poems where typically where the text is found somewhere complete and whole in some way, and the poet erases parts of the text to change the meaning of the text. So here, sometimes erasure poems actually remove the text that they don't want you to see, so you can only see the new version of the text. And sometimes it's done the way Tyehimba Jess does it here with Leadbelly Mythology, where the complete text or the complete portion of the text that he wants us to see is here, and the part that he wants to black out, it's also called blackout poetry, the part that he wants to black out is also here in a way that we can see it. So we can read it with the part that is revealed, and it'll make sense in one way. We can read it with the part that is blacked out, and it'll make sense in another way. And then we can read it all together, and it'll make sense in a third way. So here he's also playing with multivocality, but he's doing it with one person's voice in order to communicate different messages. Come on, Tyehimba. I'm Claire. He can write. He didn't even write this. He didn't even write this. Lomax wrote it, but he can write. Or not Lomax, but the warden. The third form that we see in this book are the contrapuntals. Now, remember, before we get to contrapuntals, I said that the prose poems for Leadbelly pretty much stop, and for any other speaker, pretty much stop around the time that Leadbelly meets Lomax. Again, indication of transition. I just love this book. So here, in the section that's called Yes, I Was Standing at the Bottom, we have the prose poem, the multivocal prose poem, Mooring Sport Moan, that we just talked about. The Salvation Army and Leadbelly are in that poem. Then we have the next poem, which is Leadbelly in the Angola prison. He's talking. The third, Leadbelly sings to his crew. And then the fourth in that section, Leadbelly receives a Lomax at the Angola prison. So that is a prose poem. And then he gets two more right after that, where he goes home and he talks about, what does he talk about? The land and breaking horses. This is on page 58. He gets that prose poem. Let me see, just to remind me. Yeah, and then he gets his last prose poem. And this prose poem has a spacing that we haven't really seen a lot with prose poetry in this book. But this is his last prose poem, Home Again. After it's birth you whole and fucked you dry, after it's straddled, rode, and stolen your sense, after your fist has wrung brute magic through bone and then bloomed fingers wide for caress, after you've nearly killed it and gladly killed for it, after it's cunted you down and kicked you in the cold, after you've left it teardropped, tongue-torn, after you've heaved up and hollered the sunrise and sea salt of its name till your throat is a hurricane of want. That's how we say it in South Carolina, want, not want. Before and after all of this, the body of woman stands waiting. It's clear Volta right there. You get the after it's this, after it's that, after it's that. So repetition, of course, is really, not of course, but repetition is really important to Tyehimba Jess. You see it a lot in here. I don't know that I need to spend a lot of time on it. It's used strategically. It's really important to him. It gives him that kind of historically black African American cadence in times that he needs to pull it out. It also gives him emphasis in times that he wants to emphasize. And then just whatever, zing, just repetition, meaning also that he also repeats images, he also repeats themes, he also repeats not just words, but there are moods that get repeated. There are just a phrase or a word that gets repeated, like minstrel. Keywords that when you see it, it's like somebody just spit in your face, and then you need a few pages, but then when you see it again, it's like, oh yeah, this is minstrel. This is a kind of minstrel. So we have Home Again, and that is his last prose poem. Brief note on repetition. There are two types of repetition that you'll typically see. One is called anaphora, which is repetition that I just read. After is repetition where the first part of a phrase is repeated. After it's birth you whole and fucked you dry. After it's straddled and rode. After it's da, da, da. And the other kind of repetition is called epiphora. So it's spelled E-P-I, epiphora. And that is when the last part of the phrase is repeated. You see that in huzzles. Villanelles, I think, also do that. And so that's the last part of the phrase. Villanelles have strategic end of line repetition. Huzzles or gozzles, but I think it's pronounced huzzles. At least that's what one of my books says. That last line pronunciation, that end of the line repetition happens. And then what you have, normally in our experience, we hear like, I have a dream that one day, I have a dream. We hear anaphora more often than we hear epiphora. Either way. So the point about this was that this Home Again is leadbelly's last prose poem. It was like a winding down after he met Lomax, or maybe an indication here at Home Again that his life is transitioned into a different state. So from here in the book, let me just look real quickly before I say it. 60. Yes, from here in the book, he doesn't end up back in prison as a prisoner, though he does end up back in prison as a almost recruiter for black musicians for Lomax to use. So it is a transition in his life. Then from there, we get to contrapuntals. So the first one we see is on page 65. No, it's not. Where did I draw that? Let's see. Let me see. The first one we see is on page 83. Yes. Page 83, when Leadbelly and Lomax are expressing their concerns about each other, their issues, the conflicts that are arising that will follow them. This is when we get contrapuntals. This is when we get this kind of multivocal poem. The first one, Leadbelly, bad nigga makes good minstrel. Again, right in my face. Ugh, just sticks there. Then you start with actual words. Lomax, have you got a pistol? Leadbelly, no sir, I got a knife. Lomax, let me see it. What do you do with that thing? And then he just goes into the poem. Notice that this little epigraph does not explain the poem. It does not summarize the poem, which a lot of epigraphs do. I've done it myself a few times, and it's usually a mistake. This epigraph gives us a little context, and then the poem is going to spiral out of that context. That's a great use of epigraph right there. So we have, we have Lomax on one side, leadbelly on the other side, and they're going down. So with contrapuntals, the one thing I wanted to say is that you can read one side and you hear that voice. The poem makes sense just with that left side. Then you can read the right side. The poem makes sense just with that right side. And then you can read it through, straight through. And the poem will make sense like that. What normally happens with contrapuntals is that the second voice, the voice on the right column, ends up being the stronger voice when you read the whole thing together. It ends up taking over the poem. So to me, it's interesting to look through, just glance through and see where Lomax has the right column versus where leadbelly has the right column. Lomax starts with the right column in this section, and then toward the end of the section, leadbelly ends 1, 2, 3 with the right column, with 3 poems in the right column. So it speaks to a kind of shift for him as a character, that he is now getting this right column, that he's getting the more dominant part of the contrapuntal. So there's that. Also want to point out that some of these contrapuntals use found text, which is typically Lomax's words from his letters or interviews and things like that. Found text is a good way to start writing contrapuntals if that's something that you're interested in. Anything else I wanted to say about this? Let me just look through really quickly at the titles. Oh, where did I write that down? Bear with me for a second. I wanted to talk about that in a different video. Okay, we're all good. Then we end with, because we're just talking about form here, then we end with sonnets, and there's a crown of sonnets. So a crown of sonnets is several sonnets where the last line of one starts the first line of the next. Then you just repeat over and over where the last line of one starts the first line of the next, and then the ending poem ends with the first line of the first poem. So it wraps around like that, like you can make it into a crown if you print them all out and link them together. They create that kind of circle. So he's playing with sonnets here. He's also playing with the crown. There is a thing called a royal crown of sonnets, where it's not in this book and we don't really have to talk about it, but it's where there are 15 sonnets, and then the 15th sonnet takes the first line of all of the previous sonnets and it becomes its own sonnet, but it also links the way we're talking about the crown links among the sonnets. So that's all I want to say about the form. One thing about sonnets is that they usually pose a problem. So it's interesting that after this point of freedom, when leadbelly and Martha can just live their lives and he can play their music and they're like hustling to make money, but they're still communicating in this sonnet form, where like leadbelly doesn't go back to speaking through prose poems. So that's something to note. He never gets back to that. He never gets back to being the same person he was before he met Lomax, 1. And then 2, sonnets are often posing a problem. So it's communicating to us that even through the form, regardless of what the words say, and it probably syncs up with the words as well, but there is a problem that needs a solution in that last section of the work. Then, I'm sorry, one more thing. Is that on this sheet or the other sheet? No, I'll talk about that in order, but I think this is great. And I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about the forms here. The form, even like if you're thinking more broadly of the book, or if you're going into a poem deeply. I'm just interested to see what you guys have to say. Talk to you soon.